get started tonight with the nature journaling. This is part 4 of our 6-part series. Next week, we'll be talking about habitats that you can find here in Manatee County and how those habitats are kind of related to some of the things we've talked about so far. And we're going to talk a little bit about, we haven't really covered birds, mammals, fish, anything like that. There's so much more we could get into. I have tended to focus on plants, and today we're talking about mushrooms, only because I'm more of an expert in those areas than I am on mammals and birds and fish and things like that. But we'll kind of we'll delve into that realm a little bit next week and just talk about some kind of best practices for kind of jotting down observations about those types of animals and what species we tend to find in certain habitats within our community. So today we are talking about fungus or mushrooms, and this is a really fun topic. I'm actually getting ready to start a whole series of webinars that are centered in more detail on mushrooms. The first one is going to be talking specifically about identification and biology, and then we're going to be talking about kind of what they do for us culturally and kind of new scientific research in the fields of medicine related to mushrooms. And then the last class, we're going to talk about mushroom foraging and cultivation and the use of mushrooms kind of as a culinary resource. So look for that. That'll be a lot of fun. And we're planning on setting up some in-person nature hikes in the fall to look for some of these mushroom species and talk about them a little bit. So if you want to come out and join me for a nature hike in the fall, I'll be sure to keep your contact information and send you that when it's available. So I wanted to start out just by asking you, the picture on this slide, does that look like what you think of when you think of a mushroom?
Not at all to me.
Right. And this is a really neat fungus. This is called Tremella fusiformis, and it's a jelly mushroom. And so it actually, it feels like algae or jelly or something that you would find more kind of in an aquatic environment. But it grows on decaying wood, and this mushroom, Tremella fusiformis, is being used in potentially helping with folks who have neurodegenerative diseases. And so it's actually being researched right now as something that is a neuroprotective. So very interesting. It just popped up on a rotten oak log in my backyard. So it's fabulous what you can find without having to go too far afield. So we're going to describe mushrooms today, talk about kind of their general forms, characteristics, a little bit about where we find them as far as habitat is concerned, a little bit about mushrooms in culture and literature, and then we have some practice activities that we'll be doing. So what is a mushroom? Well, a mushroom tends to be, when we think of a mushroom, we are thinking of the fruiting body of a fungus, right? So it's part of a larger, more complex organism. The mushroom isn't the be all and end all of the organism. It's just the fruiting body. And that fruiting body is responsible for facilitating reproduction. So mushrooms reproduce through structures called spores, and these spores have to get out into the environment, interact with water, and then they can exchange genetic information and undergo meiosis, and they will become a new fungal organism, right? So the function of the mushroom is to spread those spores. That's the job of the mushroom. And so some mushrooms will spread spores via the air. And I'll show you a picture of one in a little bit that really commonly you see around, and it spreads via air. And basically it just, you poke it and all the spores go poof out of the side and float away. Some mushrooms are intended to be eaten by animals and then have the spores spread in that way. The mushroom that you see here on this slide, it smells like rotting meat and it attracts flies. And then those flies come and land on the mushroom and they pick up the spores and spread them around. So mushrooms have really created a lot of interesting ways for their spores to be spread over the course of evolution. And there are some fascinating structures that they take. So if a mushroom is only one part of a fungus, what are some of the other parts of a fungus? Does anybody know what some of the other parts of a fungus are? No? That's okay, we're going to talk about it. But before we do that, I want to give you all a chance to talk about the homework from last week. So I'm going to go ahead, and we have a small group today, only 9 folks, but I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. And I'll pause the recording as we go into breakout rooms so we don't have a bunch of dead air while folks are in their breakout rooms. And I just want you to talk about your experience, talk about, what you looked at, whether or not you were able to identify anything, and then we'll come back and share out. And I'll give you about 3 minutes in your breakout room to talk with your classmates. Okay, let's see here. Oh, let's see, we need to move. Move to room 2. All right, there we go. Okay, you should be all set to join with your partner and exchange information about the they had 60 seconds to wrap it up, so they should be joining us soon.
Mute myself again because it's noisy here.
All right, welcome back. So who wants to share how was the homework last week? What did you take away from it? Any insights, any inquiries?
For me, it was super exciting to really actively listen, to kind of just open myself up to see what am I hearing without moving or without making noise. And one of the things that I was sharing with Holly and Joanne is I heard a repetition of a bird, like squeaking in repetition of 3s, which I thought was super interesting. And the bird, I was trying to like get a really good view of it, but it was high in the tree, and the type of tree was a palm tree. So I was solid on that. And the bird was, it had like a little black mohawk. It reminded me a little bit ish of, it was like gray, and it reminded me ish of like a woodpecker size. And it was just like a high squeak and repetition of 3, and the bird had something in its mouth, but I couldn't kind of distinguish what it was. So I didn't know if that had to deal with food, sharing food, some kind of thing like that. But that was something that stood out to me a lot this week.
Nice. Yeah, a lot of birds are in mating mode right now. So you'll see a lot of males out there doing like funny dances and swooping their wings all around and carrying little sticks around and building nests and stuff like that. So it's a good time to observe birds because they're putting on some pretty good behavior right now.
Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah, great. Anybody else want to share?
I saw some this morning. I saw a wood duck and little babies
Aw.
in our retention pond. I forgot to mention that. That was the highlight of the week, and I forgot it. So
Nice.
I saw a cardinal in my yard, one of my favorite birds, and I observed it because I wasn't quite sure what how the song sounded. So I waited, and sure enough, I did hear it sing, and then I went inside and confirmed it by listening on a computer. And I heard a woodpecker, which is easy to identify, one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
And no, that's about it. But it was fun just being outside and having this assignment, and it makes you actually observe nature.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Focusing on that, on being in the moment, right?
Mhm.
That's why I really like this activity as well. And I've done iterations of this activity with kids as young as 3 as well, taking them out on a hike and having them listen. And yeah, it's really a good way to kind of focus your attention and be present in the moment. So
Speaking of the woodpecker, I've done something similar to that with my neighbor since she was a year and a half old. And I would take her out and we would talk about the different birds. And one day we're out there in the yard and I heard a woodpecker and I said, "Hey, what's that?" She said, "It's a peckerwood." She was so excited. She was close. She was 3.
Yeah. We last night at dinner, my daughter said, "Mommy, do you know what a cult is?" And I was like, what are they teaching you at school? I don't know. Tell me, what is a cult? And she said, it's a young horse. And I was like, oh, a colt.
That's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah,
That
being
is.
surrounded by children is quite fun. All right, let's see. So we kind of already talked about this. I just wanted to reiterate, mushrooms are kind of misunderstood. For a long time, they were considered part of the plant family. If you look at like the phylogeny of life, right? We recognize now that mushrooms are actually much more closely related to humans than they are to plants, because of the way that their bodies are formed and the types of compounds that their bodies are formed of. They are non-photosynthetic, so they don't have the ability to produce sugars from sunlight. So they were completely removed from that group. So mushrooms are in a class of their own. Fungi are in a class of their own. And I would ask you this question: of the 3 things on this slide, if they were A, B, and C, which one is a mushroom?
I would guess based on the first slide you showed us, B.
Yeah.
But then that was probably a trick that you threw at us.
Yeah, I would go with B as well, based upon that exact same logic.
Okay. Anybody have any other guesses?
A's my second guess.
Okay. So A is a mushroom. A is what's called an earth star mushroom. They are in the same kind of group of mushrooms as puffballs, giant puffballs, which are delicious. And I grew up eating them in Indiana. But they're called puffballs. This like group of mushrooms is called that because they do, you can kind of just squeeze them and their spores just poof out into the air, and it almost looks like smoke because it hangs in the air for a long period of time. You find puffballs or earth stars growing in mulch in landscapes very frequently. So they're pretty common. In the middle, this is something that's commonly called a slime mold, but they're not technically a fungus. They actually belong to a different class of organisms, the archaea. I think that's right. I'll have to double check that. But these are actually not considered mushrooms. They're not considered fungus. They're part of something different, but they are called slime molds. The one on the right is moss. So that's a plant. That's a photosynthetic organism. It's easy for us. We have we know about portobellos, right? Because we get them at the grocery store. We know about white button mushrooms because we get them at the grocery store. We see certain types of mushrooms and we generally associate them as mushrooms. And so we aren't as used to looking at other types of mushrooms and thinking that that's what they are. We mentioned that a mushroom is only one part of a larger organism. And they really, that reproductive structure, the mushroom itself is not even the most important thing that mushroom does or that fungus does. They really are pivotal in nutrient cycling in almost every type of ecosystem. When you look across the entire globe, from wetlands to deserts to Arctic tundra, mushrooms or fungus, just broadly fungus, are really integral to nutrient cycling in these environments, in almost every environment. And they're pivotal because they are kind of the base level decomposers on the planet, right? Something dies, a fungus is going to consume it and turn its constituent parts into usable nutrients for the rest of the ecosystem. Not only are they responsible for breaking down matter and making it available and accessible to other species, they also form symbiotic relationships with over 90% of all terrestrial plant species. And it's not the fruiting body that we worry about so much when we're talking about these symbiotic relationships, but it's the mycelium. And the mycelium is kind of like you can think of it as like the roots almost, right? So the mycelium forms this network, almost like a spider web in the soil. Or it could be a fungus that inhabits the bodies of plants or insects. And that mycelium is growing throughout that media, and it could be actually the largest living organism on the entire planet is a fungus. It's a mycelial mat in Oregon that is over 2,000 square miles. So it's genetically identical. If you look at a fruiting body from one area and a fruiting body from another area, they're genetically identical and connected through this mycelial network in the soil. And so this mycelium works in tandem with plant roots, either by growing into the plant roots or growing on the plant roots to increase the surface area of the plants that is then available for the absorption of nutrients and water. Also, the plant shares sugars with the mycelium, with the mushroom, and then the mycelium shares nutrients with the plant. So the plant gets nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, manganese, all the things it needs from this mycelial network, while the mushroom or mycelium is getting sugars from the plant. So they have this really great symbiotic relationship. And within that relationship, it actually facilitates a type of pseudo communication between trees and between plants that live in a similar geographic region. So you can have mycelium running below the soil, connected to a pine tree here, and then 100 yards away, it's around blueberry roots, and it's the same organism, same mycelium connecting these two different plant species. And you can actually find instances where you can, what they've done is they've injected an irradiated chemical into a tree, and they have traced its movement through the mycelial network to other plants in a forest. And we know that sometimes healthy trees will actually put more sugars into the mycelial network to share with smaller species that are maybe struggling, or smaller trees that are maybe struggling. And so there's kind of this push and pull, and it's almost like the mycelial network is a little highway, and it's facilitating the sharing of resources and information throughout this community, right? Throughout whatever community you're in. And wherever there are terrestrial plants, you find this kind of network of sharing of resources and chemical information, right? When a tree is attacked by a pest, it's going to produce certain compounds in reaction to that attack. Those compounds get sent through the mycelial network, and then other trees surrounding that tree are triggered to produce that chemical as well. So it's almost like you have one tree that gets attacked by a pest, and then the trees surrounding are able to kind of build up their own defenses. So it really is fascinating when you start to dig into the ways in which plants and fungi are connected within our terrestrial ecosystems. There's the evidence to support what's called phytoremediation of polluted soils. So fungal organisms will take up heavy metals at a higher rate than other, like let's say a plant. So if you planted a tree and you spread out some mycelium in an area, the mushroom would pull more heavy metals out of the soil or contaminated waterway than the tree would. And so there's been a lot of research in looking at, okay, how do we use mushrooms then to clean up polluted soils? This is one of the reasons why it can be dangerous for people who are non-experts to go out and collect mushrooms and eat them, because you do find in some instances mushrooms that have accumulated these toxic levels of heavy metals, and then people consume them without realizing that is occurring, and then they can get really sick. Mushrooms are a great food source for mammals, insects, gastropods, us, right? We love mushrooms. They provide essential amino acids, and especially for people that are vegetarian or vegan, these amino acids are things that you generally can't get unless you're eating meat. So vegetarians and vegans, they love mushrooms because it can give them these amino acids that they need, and a lot of really good minerals as well. So this slide here only touches on kind of the tip of the iceberg for what mushrooms can do and what they do for us. There's a ton of information out there on kind of medical properties of certain types of mushrooms and things that are being researched right now, but I'm going to leave that for another presentation. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how sort of awesome and awe-inspiring this group of organisms are. And what's really cool, this picture here, so the thing that looks like a worm is a nematode. And nematodes are microscopic little guys, and they get into the roots of our plants, and darn it if they don't get my tomatoes every year. But nematodes are omnipresent. They're everywhere, but they can be a real problem for plants. There is a type of fungus that actually creates these little donut structures here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Creates these little donut structures here, and they swell with liquid when the nematode goes through them, and they trap the nematode. Then the mycelium grow into the nematode and harvest its nutrients back for the rest of the organism. So they actually can hunt. They catch nematodes and grow into them and steal their food, steal their nutrition. So just an amazingly fascinating world goes on microscopically beneath our feet, especially where fungus is concerned. So what are the parts of the fungus, right? You have the mycelium, which is the largest part of the organism, right? We talked about that one that's out in Oregon. It's 2,000 square miles. The hyphae are an individual strand of a collective mycelium. So a mycelium is basically like the whole cobweb, and the hyphae is one string in the cobweb. These hyphae can have specialized functions like we saw with the nematode consumption, or in the case of mycorrhizal fungi, those are the ones that have that symbiotic relationship with plants. So mycorrhizal fungi, those hyphae are going to have very specialized functions. They're going to either grow on or into plant roots, and they're going to share resources with that plant. They're going to have a reproductive structure. It can be spore bearing, or it will be spore bearing, but it's going to differ in shape for the different species. So you can see these 4 photos represent 4 very different shapes that these reproductive structures take. Some of them grow in clusters. So you see this, the tan mushroom growing in clusters here in the middle. This is an armillaria or a honey mushroom. These are not so good for trees. They're parasitic on trees. But you can see this has kind of a typical mushroom shape, right? You see this stalk here, this nice well-defined cap, but it's growing in a big cluster, and you're usually going to find this either growing on wood that is decayed, laying on the ground already, or on a living tree that is dying. You're not going to find this growing kind of on healthy wood or anything like that. And you're not going to find it growing right out of the soil either. You also have what are called conchs or polypores, which are these structures here that are growing out of the side of this log. They kind of look like ears. These are a type of turkey tail mushroom, turkey tail fungus, and they also called shelf fungus. So they kind of grow out in these little shelves from the wood that they are consuming. And these, we'll show a picture of the gills here on in a slide or so, and that's where the spores are contained. On these conchs or shelf fungus, the underside of this little shelf is going to be spongy, and it's going to look like it has a bunch of tiny little tubes in it. And those tiny little tubes are where the spores are stored, kind of in that in those mushrooms. And then we talked about these 2 at the beginning, Tremella fusiformis, and this guy is a stinkhorn. And they have those very different shapes, right? Very different structures. And they all have mycelium somewhere either within the wood or in the soil here, but we're not seeing it. So here are some of the distinguishing characteristics of mushrooms, things that we can learn to talk about and identify to help us figure out what kind of mushroom we're looking at. So the top part of the mushroom right here, this is called the cap. On the underside of that mushroom are the gills, and the gills are where the spores are located. These are under a microscope, right? You're not going to be able to see these with the naked eye. This is what spores look like to the naked eye. They look like dust, just like a dark dust. And we'll talk about taking a spore print so you can get these images, because I think they're actually beautiful. And I encourage everybody to Google spore print art and look at some of the really neat things that can be made using mushroom spore prints. Some mushrooms have what's called a ring or a skirt. So here we have our cap, our gills. This is the stalk. Sometimes on the stalk, there may be this ring or skirt, okay? The ring or skirt is usually where the cup or vulva was connected to the stalk, okay? So you can see here, stalk, very barely defined stalk. Some mushrooms have a veil that comes down like this. Some mushrooms have a cup, and you'll see that where they're connected to whatever media they're growing in. So whether it's decaying wood or soil, that cup will be present. And then this is to show you what mycelium looks like. Mycelium, again, it kind of looks like a fuzzy white spider web in the soil or in the wood. You may have seen this before and not known what you were looking at. A lot of times, if you have mulched beds in your landscape, you can kind of pick up the top few inches of mulch and kind of look underneath, and you'll see mycelium all throughout there. They really like that interplay between the decaying wood mulch and that kind of moist soil right there. So again, this is the mycelium. This is the largest part of the fungal organism, and this is the part that's really doing the hard work. This is the part that's breaking down organic matter. This is the part that's making nutrients available. This is the part that's holding soil together. This is the part that's, performing all of those necessary ecosystem services. This mycelium, this is the workhorse. This guy, this is just there to spread the spores. That's what that's for. But they are very interesting to look at. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one more time. We have cap, gills, spores, ring or skirt. The stalk is kind of like the stem. You can kind of think of it like the stem. The veil, the vulva or cup, and the mycelium. And we're going to go ahead and go back and exit so I can get the link. I'm going to post the link in the Jamboard. We have a Jamboard activity. And if you'll click the link for the Jamboard, I should have, I think I got the settings all right this time. So you should be able to go to the Jamboard. And what we're going to do there is we're going to draw an arrow to the different characteristics that are specified at the top of the Jamboard. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep my screen just like this so I can see you all. I'm going to stop my share so it doesn't confuse anybody. Click on the link in the chat, go to the Jamboard, and then I'll give you just a couple minutes to work on this, and then I'll pull it up for us all to look at.